Record. All right, so I think I'm recording right now.
Okay, so let's go and start.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So topic five explores political culture and political participation. So first, political culture is the kind of collection of political values and practices a government is based on. Um, the government's role in, I guess, keeping its power uh, often depends upon adhering to the ideas and political values of its peoples. So if a government wants to remain viable, it often has to adhere to these values. And then with political culture comes the idea of social capital. And social capital is the trust between citizens and state. So often you'll see in a more authoritarian society that's anti-individual, there's not really much value on social capital. Whereas in a liberal, I guess, democracy, you'll see a lot of value as the government relies on the input of the people. And so within political culture, I guess the two differentiating systems are consensual political culture and conflictual. So consensual is basically where the citizens, although there might be some differences, the majority finds the ruling government to be legitimate, and the solutions to the problems that they have, although they might not exactly agree, they accept their legitimacy. Whereas in a conflictual political culture, you'll see a difference of opinions that often can't lead to the government being able to rule. So often these are citizens disagreeing on values like communism versus capitalism or religion. And so then moving in, I guess the political ideologies that are shaped by political culture are first liberalism. So liberalism um, is the idea that the government should promote the maximum individual political and economic freedom for its people. Uh, it sees the values of things such as free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, basically freedom of idea, and it often promotes disagreement in the government's political, I guess, decisions. Um, and then in contrast to that is communism. So communism values equality over freedom. Communism it sees fault in liberalism, and it sees that a often a small minority ends up owning the majority of the wealth, leaving, I guess, the majority poor to suffer. In communism, it says that the state must take over all resources to ensure equality. And then socialism, it agrees with liberalism in that it values some individual freedoms, such as private ownership of property, as well as a somewhat free market, but it delineates in that it sees the government or the state should have some role in regulating the economy. And then finally, fascism, it agrees with communism in that it devalues the idea of freedom, but it's not like communism in that it also rejects the idea of equality. Um, it is often separates people into factions of inferior and superior, and these are often based on the social cleavages, which we'll get at in just a second. And also, forgot to mention, religions often have um, a part in government. So, like a secular state, often or it won't have religious input, whereas a non-secular state, such as countries in the Middle East that or Islam that Abidal Islam will have, I guess, Sharia law. And so then within political participation, the groups that make up a country or make up a society are called social cleavages. And so social cleavages, they're kind of the mixture of social classes, ethnic groups, religions, and languages, or anything that can, I guess, differentiate people within a country. Um, and so then within a country, political institutions often form to, I guess, represent the ideas of the cleavages, as sometimes, especially if they're either a minority or not represented, their ideas can not see fruition in political decisions. And so then I guess going off between the citizen and state relationships, the idea of political efficacy is the citizen's capacity to understand and influence political events. So obviously, in a liberal uh, government, uh, people will be able to put their more influence on the government, whereas a like authoritarian society, they're not going to be able to influence the government as much. Um, and so the final idea with political participation is that you often have some form of no country. So a more authoritarian country, it might be like subject activities that don't really involve input, but more obedience. So like, I guess, obeying the law, paying taxes, stuff like that. Whereas in liberalism, you'll see like voting. So the idea that you could elect officials to represent you. And so, yeah.
Okay, so my part, as John mentioned before, in order for a liberal democracy, in order for that to succeed, in order for that to thrive, it needs a way for the people to get to the state and a way for the state to represent the interests of the people. And as John mentioned before, there are multiple ways that the people can go about doing that. One of them is social movements, which is an organized group of people who aim to bring about some sort of change or resist some change in the state or the society. Um, Social movements often challenge or change the social norms and the status quo of a society, and they usually take stances on issues that are maybe outside of the mainstream in a society. There are a lot of examples of successful and unsuccessful social movements in modern history. I mean, one of them is the women's suffrage movement, and at the time, maybe these women were seen as radicals for wanting to have the right to vote in America or in the UK, but over time, the rights that women have to vote have been seen as just normal, everyday things that we shouldn't think about. Another example of a social movement that was successful is the African National Congress, which successfully ended apartheid and freed their leader, Nelson Mandela, from prison. Oftentimes, even if a social movement isn't successful in bringing about the policy change that it wants to, it can also often uh, just shift the political opinion of a certain state or society. They could shift the Overton window to one direction or the other. An example of that would be a poignant example would be the Black Lives Matter movements that are happening nowadays. I mean, while some of the demands aren't being met by them, they've brought a lot of attention and challenged a lot of people's thoughts about the ongoing effects of slavery in America and beyond. Um, another way for the state to interact with the people is a civil society. Civil societies are like voluntary organizations that exist outside of the state and outside of country borders that help people define and advance the interests of their group of people or their identity. Um, yeah, civil societies are often bigger in more liberal and democratic nations that emphasize freedom of speech and inalienable rights, and things like that. The key job of civil society is to prevent the tyranny of the majority, which is the tendency of a democracy to allow the majority to rule, and while also neglecting the rights of a small minority group. Um, in a lot of cases, civil societies operate as NGOs or non-government organizations, and they operate more throughout the people and the people they're representing, and they don't exist within a government or within a certain country. They often exist beyond borders and around the globe. Uh, yeah, social societies often try to bring about cosmopolitanism, which is just a belief that societies should try to draw influences from certain identities or certain countries, which is honestly kind of what we're doing in this class. Um, Political institutions are a more state-centered way for the state to interact with the people. They're called linkage institutions, which connect the government to its citizens directly. In America's case, we have the two-party system with the Republicans and Democrats, and I mean we have a bunch of smaller political parties, but they often stand zero chance in any national election. So America is widely regarded to have a two-party system. And while many of us do see a two-party system as kind of the norm in America. Worldwide, that's not the case. There's only about 15 countries in the world who have a long-standing two-party system today. Um, Most countries favor a multi-party system, which obviously has more than two political parties, and they're more common in countries with the strong parliamentary system. But the job of a party is mostly to give its voters an easy way to identify with a candidate or identify the policies of a candidate and who they sympathize with, really. So yeah, that's our that's our little thing. Wait, that'll share screen.